Today I want to talk about people who spend so long being the most capable person in the room that they stop noticing when the room has changed. A couple who had every reason to trust their own instincts, right up until the one place those instincts were the least reliable tool they had. What happened to them at the bottom of Lake Mead still bothers me. It happened in the Overton arm of Lake Mead National Recreation Area, home to a sunken World War II B-29 bomber resting in roughly 100 to 160 feet of water, depending on the season. Lake Mead has quietly become the deadliest national park site in the country, with drowning as its single leading cause of death. Past 100 feet, water temperature drops into the low 50s, visibility collapses in the silt, and divers start absorbing enough nitrogen to feel it. It's called narcosis, and it works like being drunk. It doesn't announce itself, it just quietly rearranges your judgment while convincing you nothing has changed. Owen Kessler was 52, a retired aircraft mechanic outside Henderson who'd spent 14 years turning himself into a serious technical diver. It wasn't a hobby anymore. It was the entire architecture of who he was. Diving the B-29 wreck was supposed to be the trophy dive, proof he'd graduated from tourist to professional. People who dove with him described him the same way, over and over. Skilled, absolutely, but allergic to being told what to do. Dive tables and no decompression limits weren't safety tools to him. They were training wheels for divers who hadn't put in his hours. He talked about depth the way some people talk about a commute. Just numbers on a gauge, he'd say. Nothing down there that a steady hand and a full tank couldn't handle. Over time, that attitude hardened into something close to a personal brand. Difficulty wasn't a signal to him. It was an inconvenience, something to push through rather than listen to. His wife, Dana Kessler, 47, had been diving alongside him for almost the entire time he'd been chasing this identity. She had her own solid logbook, reef dives in the Caribbean, a handful of wrecks off the Carolina coast, an ice diving certification she was quietly proud of. But nearly every serious dive she'd logged in the last decade had been planned, briefed and led by Owen. Somewhere in that decade, his comfort with risk had folded itself into her own sense of what was reasonable, and neither of them ever noticed the fold happening. They'd met at a dive shop in Arizona, back when he was already logging wrecks and she was still doing pool certifications. Marriage turned them into a permanent dive team, and every trip that went well made the next one easier to trust blindly. A pattern formed without either of them naming it. Owen called the dive, Dana followed the call, and from the inside it never felt like dependence. It felt like two experienced divers simply agreeing. Honestly, it's hard to blame her. He had the hours, the gear, the wrecks under his belt, and trusting the person with the longer resume is usually a reasonable habit. On every previous dive, that habit had paid off. Nothing had ever gone sideways enough to test it. The problem is that all of that confidence had been built in conditions nowhere near what the B-29 demands. Lake Mead doesn't forgive the same mistakes a shallow reef dive does. Past 100 feet, narcosis chips away at reaction time and reasoning before a diver feels anything resembling danger, and the people most affected are frequently the last to notice it's happening to them at all. The Kesslers booked a guided excursion through one of the few outfitters the Park Service permits to run divers to the wreck, a strict arrangement capping visitor numbers and requiring advanced certification just to board the boat. The plan was standard: a morning briefing, a swim along the float line, a capped bottom time with mandatory decompression stops built into the ascent. The first dive of the trip went smoothly. Both passed their pre-dive checks, their gas planning was sound, and their buoyancy control looked sharp to the guide watching from the surface. Nothing about that first dive challenged anything Owen already believed about himself. If anything, it confirmed it. The wreck wasn't the milestone he'd built it up to be in his head. It was just another dive he happened to be better at than everyone else on the boat. That confirmation reshaped how they treated the guide's briefings. Turnaround pressure, no deco limits, buddy checks. Both started nodding along without absorbing any of it, the way you nod through a safety video you've already seen. Dana half joked the depth gauge was basically decorative by now. Owen didn't disagree. On the boat ride out for the second dive, one of the dive masters mentioned, almost in passing, that narcosis doesn't care how many logged hours you have. It hits engineers and instructors exactly the same way it hits first-timers. Owen laughed it off, told her that after 14 years he could tell the difference between narked and tired with his eyes closed. She didn't push it. She just said the water doesn't know who you are. It became a routine between them. Whenever a guide asked how they were feeling at depth, Owen answered first, always fine, always sharp, and Dana's answer echoed his a few seconds later. It wasn't that she couldn't judge her own condition. It's that at 130 feet, in grey silty water, his confidence became the only reference point either of them had left. Midway through the trip, both privately agreed the guided pace felt too cautious for divers of their level. Owen felt like the outfitter was treating them like open-water tourists instead of the technical divers they considered themselves to be. They didn't break from the group formally. They just quietly decided that if a moment came to push past what the guide called for, they would. That moment came on their third and final dive, a planned descent to the tail section of the wreck at just under 140 feet. The morning was clear, current was minimal, and the guide's brief called for a strict 18-minute bottom time before a staged descent with 2 safety stops. By that point in the trip, the dive no longer felt like something to earn. It felt like something they'd already proven they were owed. For the first several minutes, everything tracked exactly to plan. Both were near the front of the group, moving cleanly along the float line just like they'd wanted. But somewhere past the 10-minute mark, their movements started losing precision in small, easy-to-miss ways. A held position starting to drift. A hand check that took 2 extra seconds too long. Nothing that would alarm anyone watching for the first time. The lead guide noticed Owen hovering slightly off his marked depth near the cockpit section, correcting himself late instead of holding steady. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing only someone trained to look for it would catch. To that guide, it read as an early narcosis signature, not simple fatigue, and it meant the dive plan needed to end immediately regardless of how much bottom time remained. The guide signaled a hard abort to both divers, the universal thumb up that means the dive is over right now. Owen's eyes, behind his mask, had a distant, glassy quality to them. He didn't argue the signal. He also didn't obey it. He just hovered there a moment longer, looking toward the tail section, like he still had unfinished business with it. Dana paused too. For a few seconds, she genuinely looked like she might turn for the line. Then Owen tapped her tank, pointed toward the wreck, and gave a lazy thumbs down instead of up. Just a little further, the gesture seemed to say. She followed him deeper instead of following the guide up. I keep thinking about that half second where she almost didn't. Owen's regulator draws slowed and turned irregular, and he began drifting instead of swimming, his fins brushing silt off the hull and clouding what visibility remained. His air consumption spiked, a body working harder than its owner realized. Then, without any visible struggle, he simply stopped moving and sank against the fuselage. Dana's coordination went next. She fumbled her own gauge check twice, staring at numbers she should have been able to read instantly. When a support diver signaled to ask if she was okay, she gave the wrong hand signal entirely, then repeated it a second time without correcting herself. She had no visible awareness that anything about her response had been off. Within moments, both divers were unresponsive to standard signaling, hovering in cold, silt-clouded water more than 100 feet down. The support team moved into emergency protocol, working to get controlled gas and buoyancy onto both of them, while radioing the surface for a medical standby. For a brief stretch, Dana still seemed reachable. She accepted a spare regulator when it was placed in her hand, and didn't fight the ascent line being clipped to her harness. But her responses kept slowing, her grip loosening, until she stopped actively participating in her own rescue altogether, forcing the support divers to control her buoyancy manually the rest of the way. Every additional minute at that depth worked against them. A controlled ascent with 2 unresponsive divers is an enormously difficult problem even with a full support team present. Forcing the guides to manage stage decompression stops for people who could no longer assist with their own buoyancy. Owen never regained consciousness during the ascent. Dana stopped responding entirely a short time later. Both were pronounced dead after being brought to the surface and given emergency care by boat crew and paramedics who met them at the dock. Neither of them ever reached the tail section they'd been trying to get back to. The dive team stayed with both of them through the ascent and the surface response that followed, doing everything protocol allowed. But cold water that deep doesn't leave much room for error once 2 divers can no longer help themselves, and by the time they reached open air, there wasn't anything left to reverse. The National Park Service confirmed both deaths within the following day, adding 2 more names to a fatality count that has made Lake Mead the most dangerous unit in the entire national park system for over a decade running. A subsequent review found no equipment failure. Tanks, regulators, and dive computers all functioned within normal specifications throughout the dive. Investigators attributed the deaths to nitrogen narcosis, compounded by a refusal to follow an emergency abort signal, impaired judgment developing faster than either diver could recognize in themselves. Conditions that day were unremarkable by the site's standards, and no outside event caused the outcome. It was just cold water and silt, and it never once cared how many hours either of them had logged. If you found this one as unsettling as I did, subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more of this kind of thing coming.